Hello and welcome to the Cottage at Woodland Corners. Today we're making ham bone soup. So ham bone soup is one of those things that's like an old Southern old-timey recipe that I really love. It's one of those comfort foods, I suppose, kind of like stew or, chicken soup. And one of the things that I really like about it is that it's also a very sort of interesting thing to make because you tend to only be able to make it after you have served a ham. So you serve your ham, which I did on Easter this year, and then you eat a lot of leftover ham for a while because hams are generally pretty large. And then after that, you have this ham bone, and usually it's not totally clean because you have to sort of work that meat off the bone. And so that's sort of what ham bone soup is relying on. Some people will really clean that bone before they get to the part where you could actually use it to make soup stock. And if you do really clean it, then I would recommend that you reserve maybe a cup or a cup and a half of cubed ham to use in this recipe because you might not have enough meat on your bone. In my case, I think you're going to see that there was a lot of meat left on that bone. So I had actually a pretty good situation where I didn't have to reserve ham for it. But like I said, I served the ham at Easter. We had a lot of ham leftovers. And then I looked up online to see if you could freeze this thing, and they said yes, you could. So I wrapped it up. I threw the bone in the freezer for when I could then get around to making the pot of soup, because it is a pretty big pot of soup that I generally make. You can see the large pot in the background, the big soup pot. You've seen it before if you've watched any of the prior videos. I make, sort of the big things in there. The great thing about this is that it's just one of those sort of austerity recipes, I suppose, where you would make this as a way to be very efficient with your food if you needed to. So instead of throwing the bone away, you can boil it and get the meat off of it and then use all of that in a large pot of soup, and the ham makes a very good stock. And you can also throw other things into that stock, and you'll see some things that I put in the stock. But in the end, you want the meat that's on the bone, and you want that bone boiled for a really long time to get the meat off, but also to produce a stock. The cheaper the ham that you purchase, the saltier the ham will be. And a lot of times if you get one that's really inexpensive, you might have to soak it for a day or two in water in order to get some of that salt to leach out, because these are preserved with salt. And if you're using a ham that has a lot of salt, you might not need to season as much as if you're using a ham that has just a little bit of salt in it or is not as salty. I guess no ham probably has a little bit of salt. They probably all have quite a bit of salt. But I know that in this particular recipe, when I made it this last time, I had to actually add salt because while I got that ham flavor, I didn't quite get the saltiness that I wanted. So that was just me and the type of ham that I had. But if I had a saltier ham, it might have worked out a little differently. So just a heads up that when you season this, I started to say take it with a grain of salt, but season to your taste and check it frequently. So you want to check the stock, make sure it doesn't taste too watery, make sure it doesn't taste too salty, and just sort of babysit that because it is going to be unique to the type of ham that you use. And you are also going to be adding water constantly because you're going to boil this for a long time. And as that water evaporates and this thing cooks down, you're going to have to keep adding water. I like to keep it at least half covered. You're going to see that it's about half covered in water. There's always a little bit peeking out. You can cover it fully. It doesn't really matter as long as this thing is boiling, but you don't want to put, so much water that you end up diluting the flavor of the ham. So I tend to just sort of keep it about halfway and then turn the bone in the pot and also add water as needed. But I don't like to start with like a huge amount because I don't want to water it down early on. You can always add more water, but it's hard to sort of take it back once you've thrown in a bunch of water. You're going to see that I threw in some shots of the kitchen garden. So I did go out and get some celery and some lemon thyme to put into this recipe. You don't have to put the lemon thyme. Thyme is recommended for this recipe, but if you don't have it, it's not a make or break deal. You can substitute something like parsley, or you could just go without it. And this recipe is going to work just as well either way. So Doesn't take much. You can just use salt and pepper, and that's totally fine. I did add some other things like bay leaves that you're going to see floating around in that pot with the ham bone. So, you know, be on the lookout for that. I do like bay leaves whenever I'm doing any sort of a savory boil. So it's good for recipes like that. And again, a lot depends on the size of the bone that you have, on how soon the meat comes off, how much water you've got in the pot. But the meat will come off when the meat comes off. You can go and poke and prod it, and you can sort of help it along as it's boiling. But ultimately, it's just going to sort of reach a point where you're going to finally be able to get that meat off the bone. And if you try to do it before that, it's not going to be easy. So I have a little bit of a problem telling you, like, this is how long you boil it, because it's going to depend on how much meat you've got on that bone and what's going on with that. But you'll see, I give you enough, I think, visual to allow you to see when you can start to peel that meat away and when you should think about maybe removing the bone and starting to get stripping the meat off of it. The only other thing I'll say is that I used to use broad beans for this. They're a little bit harder to find now, at least for me where I'm grocery shopping. But I now use a couple different beans. So you're going to see that I'm throwing in pinto beans, I'm throwing in black beans, and I also add a little bit of corn in there because I like the sweet corn I've mentioned before. But I love this recipe because it has a lot of color to it. You've got that, I guess, like the big three, right? Like the carrots, celery, and onion, which are in a lot of soups and stews as a startup part of the recipe. And you've got that here too. So those add a lot of really great color. I like to include the celery leaves, especially when it's from the garden. They are super strong, and they are also more fibrous and sort of tough than the ones that I would normally buy at the grocery store. I do like to use them when I'm cooking. I don't necessarily want to put them onto a salad because they're very tough compared to the sort of soft leaves that you get in the store-bought celery. So you'll see some of the leafy greens in there, and that is the celery tops that I reserve for, not just for stock, but for also actually putting in there. And once they're cooked down, they're a lot more soft and more palatable. They have a better texture once they're cooked, like most greens. And I think that's about all I have to say about ham bone soup. So with that, let's get cooking. Thanks for tuning in and watching this episode on ham bone soup. I hope you enjoyed watching the recipe today. And if you have ideas or thoughts, or if you try this and would like to let me know how it worked out for you, I would love to hear from you in comments. Like and subscribe if you'd like to support the channel or see more content like this. And thanks for watching.